for them to watch. That link will be available to you. But we've got an hour and 15 in the schedule. We won't be hanging up at the hour and 15 mark. Actually, we'll be hanging out for about the next half an hour and continuing with questions, or maybe opening up for some dialogue and conversation. On the session we did earlier, we even had to hang up at the end of the half an hour with some people still hanging out with us with questions. So feel free to use that time more casually at the end of the format. If you want to hit social media with us, feel free. Everything on here is anonymized from the clients who've participated, but effectively is public domain information for everybody to learn from. So feel free to socialize it wherever you like. And a quick thank you and shout out to IFMA, the RICS and the IWFM for their support in this idea of a unified approach to the measurement standards, so that we can actually have common information that we're all freely making freely accessible to the membership across those three organizations. Right, so as part of the context, I need to remind you, if you've used the tool before, and for those people who might be new to the Leesman ecosystem, a little bit about us. So launched back in 2010. Actually, the first survey was launched on June the 9th to Hanro, who's on the call, who's been with us through thick and thin ever since, surveying his portfolio, and whose data is in this new group. So thank you, Hanro. Big shout out to you, mate, for being such an awesome buddy along the way. But 10 years doesn't feel like it, but well, sometimes it does, but most of the time it doesn't. Today, sitting on 740,000 individual employee records, responses. So that's sitting there, all pretty much answering the same questions. We added a couple about year 3 of the questionnaire when some things started to emerge, but since then, every respondent has answered the core questions in exactly the same way. 4,940 workplaces that then crosses. We reckon estimated that to be about 14 million square meters of real estate, and dispersed across 95 countries, amazingly, with the survey tool off the shelf available in its 37 core languages. Now, the best visual metaphor, just to remind you of how we work, is as the radiographers of workplace. All we do is take the X-ray. There's no consultancy services, no advisory services. I'm not trying to sell you a PPE supplier at the moment. I'm not trying to reorganize your furniture. There's nothing else you can take from us in that respect. So we're just here to give you the black and white, the candid, myth-busting approach to what the data is saying. That fundamentally boils down to the power of benchmarking with 740,000 employees, and that geographic disbursement we can report on any subsector that you might like. So vertical distribution by country, by industry subsector, by building typology, you name it. So the benchmarking gathering its power almost on a daily basis. Key part of that is the identification of high performance workplace experience for employees. So a small group of buildings that we hive off and isolate under our Leesman Plus categorization, which are those delivering outstanding experience and statistically robust response rates. And a whole heap of those people on the call this morning sitting on their Leesman Plus award trophies, well, back in their offices perhaps, sat there with their trophies to recognize that amazing experience that they've delivered. But very much so, that data group used as a stretch target in understanding how workplaces really can perform for the betterment of the organization and the employee. Now that obviously then feeds into the research, the bit that Peggy is the absolute gatekeeper for. We take our responsibilities there very seriously. Having sat on a database of that size, gathering pace that quickly, you know, our key remit in effect is to find out what's going on inside it and populate that as widely and as freely as we can. You never ever pay to attend one of our events. You never pay to access one of our publications. And part of Alison's plan this year is to move us to a B Corporation status. If any of you come across that, basically it's a for benefit organization, for benefit of the wider community and for the users of the tool, not a purely profit-driven organization as a private enterprise. So part of our wider sort of cooperative position, all bundled up in that research agenda. Right, the survey structure. Now, I'm outlining the office survey structure for what will become apparently clear in a moment, which is that the office structure, or the office design, the design of the office tool based centrally around activities. So 21 activities that we ask employees whether they are relevant to them in their role, and if they are, how well they're supported. we absolutely and fundamentally believe that you cannot design a workplace or the service infrastructure around it if you don't have a deep understanding of what an employee does in their role for you. And everything there effectively should come from an employee-centric design approach outward. We then ask 10 compulsory questions, our workplace impact questions. These, in effect, are the reason for having workplace. So sense of productivity, sense of pride, community, etc. All those values bundled up in those 10 questions. We take the results for those questions, we add them together, and from that calculate a 0 to 100 linear score of workplace experience, or if you like, workplace effectiveness, a measure of how well the workplace supports the employee in the role they're employed to do. That's the Leesman index calculation side of the equation. The other side is all of the other data you need in order to understand why some of those things may or may not be supported well on the left-hand side of the screen. So 25 physical features, 25 service features, and then a whole load of filters that you can cut and slice the data by around demography, mobility, etc. Now, the reason I present that to you is because when we designed and launched this tool, which my amazing team managed to do in about 6 weeks, which is probably about 6 months worth of work condensed into that period, is that the activity profile part of our home working assessment is exactly the same. The activities that employees undertake hasn't really changed. So that was fundamental to us, that we had to ask the same questions. The impact questions have changed slightly, and Peggy will take you through those to reflect more the impact orientation of home working. And from that, therefore, we calculate a new linear score, still 0 to 100, but an HLMI, a home Leesman index score. On the right-hand side, what we then have is a much reduced features list, because clearly at home, people have a sort of compressed range of features, but almost all of the demographic filters and mobility filters that you would see on the core Leesman office survey still baked in there. Now, this is really, for me, out of all of the material that's being populated across our industry widely at the moment, this for me is the one thing that I think is being totally and utterly forgotten. And if there's one thing that I would ask you to take away from today, it is this statement in itself, that for almost all employees, not all, but for almost all, what they do in the organization has not materially changed. The location and the services on offer to them have changed dramatically, no doubt there, but what they're being expected to do really hasn't changed that much. So hence our methodology approach, which is to say, we understand how the workplace can support the role. The place has now shifted, but the role hasn't. So our activity questions are absolutely the same for that fundamental reason. And that's what gives us this apples to apples comparison. It may be a Golden Delicious compared to a Granny Smith's, but they're still apples. It's still the role that we're understanding how well the place supports. Now that, I think, opens up a really interesting debate around the competition, in effect, between home and office. And that's obviously what our data is going to fuel the debate around. And this is the early cut of that equation. Now, the survey itself, 4 minutes online, so really super efficient and focused. Standardized core, that question set that Peggy will take you through has been exactly the same for all of the respondents so far, and will remain the same as we head out into the sort of long tail exit from COVID. At 75% response rate, so high engagement rates. Employees clearly want to have their opinions heard, and those organizations working with us really putting their arm around the shoulder of the employee and checking that actually things are okay for them. Available in the same 37 languages off the shelf, but with a whole heap of new functionality we've built into Tableau to make sure that you can get to the information we harvest super quick if you're working with us on deploying for surveys. And that's the key point here. This is not a public domain survey that anybody across the world has been able to submit data to. These are organizations who've adopted the Leesman tool and deployed it in their own organization as part of their crisis management, as part of their distributed workforce management, and now as part of their re-entry, reoccupation strategies going forward, and then even over the horizon in terms of their future workplace strategies. The PDF will also have a link in it that you can click to get through to the demo version. It is just a demo, the data doesn't go anywhere, but if you're super keen to get to that, it's all over the website. You can play with that to your heart's content until you get a PDF. If you would like a PDF of this deck, we will not be automatically sending it to all delegates because it's a little large on the size and we don't want to be bombarding everybody with spam they don't want. So if you would like a copy, pop it either in the Q&A, and Beth and Alison will try and keep track, or probably better is email your Leesman contact person. They will send it straight back to you. It'll be in our online filing by the end of today. So they'll get that to you if you would like it, rather than us just chucking it at you. Right then, the numbers. As I said, from the outset, we said we would report the minute we pass 10,000. So the data that Peggy will take you through, 10,600 respondents across 90 workplace populations, 14 of the early adopting organizations therefore represented, and 16 countries that data is distributed across. But in live surveys currently open and due to close within the next 3 weeks, one of them already about to close, the rest at the tail end of that, alive today, as of this morning, another 32,000 employees have responded. That's 231 workplace populations, 5 additional organizations. Can't tell you the countries yet because we have to squirrel around behind the scenes before the surveys are closed, and we didn't have a chance to do that this morning. So look, that's where the numbers are going in terms of the magnitude of the insights. Peggy's team super excited. They have to sit on their hands when they're trying to work just not to get too buzzy around the potential for that number. And I'm really just reinforcing then the time and effort that my team have been spending on the data visualizations. You're going to start to see more of these types of heat maps. We're really keen to support you in what we know is some really rapid deployment tactical work to understand where all the pain points are. Those of you who've been around us for a long time know that the original origins to the Leesman tool were in tools like Lean and Six Sigma, error diagnostic tools, as well as the more empathetic end of personality profiling techniques like Myers-Briggs and PRISM. So these new visualizations really enabling you to traffic light immediately, knowing where some of the issues are, or some of those things that need to be baked into future strategies for you to resolve as your teams re-emerge. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Peggy, but with one caveat, then it's reinforcing what I just said, that this is really early data. It's us fulfilling our promise, which we always try and do for you from a data integrity perspective. But what it has shown already is huge diversity. And actually the data is swinging all over the place. Each time something closes, a picture might change largely or smallly, depending on each of the lines. Peggy's going to try and give you some insights into that. But these are key findings thus far. We'll come straight back to you, I think, the minute we pass 50,000 respondents with another briefing. So what is happening right now is that the internal benchmarking for those organizations who are using this survey, I would say, is way more valuable than the external benchmarking. Not obviously withstanding the magnitude of what we've got and what we're trying to give you this morning in terms of early insights, but sometimes the internal is revealing way more than we can do when we start to aggregate an average. But Peggy's going to take you through all of those things right now.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and hello everyone. I have to admit I'm having a little bit of a déjà vu feeling since we've already done this once this morning, but I can assure you that I am just as excited, or perhaps even more excited, to share these interesting insights with you guys as I was this morning with the previous group. So let's dig in. Before we start looking at the actual experience numbers of those who are working from home at the moment, I wanted to just share what the stats are in terms of where these employees who have responded to the survey are currently working from. So what we find, or what we would have assumed, is of course that most of the employees, or most of the respondents, are currently working from home. The numbers are 92% to be exact, which means that among those, or across the 14 organizations that we have run the survey with so far, 8% of employees are actually not working from home at the moment, so are assumingly still based in their office. And I just wanted to point out here that this means, in terms of responding to the survey, those who don't work from home at the moment, they still do get questions to respond to, but the only difference there is that they answer questions about how they think that the home environment would support them if they were working from home, rather than asking about their current experience of home working. And this means that we will be able to do quite interesting comparisons between whether, if there are differences between those who are currently experiencing home working and the perception that people have of home working without actually having that experience. Today, we're going to focus solely on the people who are working from home and their actual experience. So we will leave that group of people who have just more so speculated on their home working experience for another day. So if we start with the main KPI for home working experience, which is of course the HLMI, we see that it is quite high. So on that scale that Tim mentioned, 0 to 100, the average home working experience currently sits at 71.3, which, to give you a little bit of perspective, the office LMI currently across all those 740,000 employees who have responded on experience questions about their offices is at 63.0. So the home working HLMI is quite significantly higher than what the experience is currently in the, let's say, average workplace around the world. And also another reference point is that we would say our threshold for an outstanding experience is at 70. So to get that Leesman Plus certification that Tim also talked about, the threshold is for the workplace to have an average LMI of 70 or above, and essentially that is then the threshold for really an outstanding experience. So essentially we can conclude that on average, employees are having a pretty outstanding experience from working from home. However, averages can sometimes be a little bit misleading. And in fact, even though 60% of the respondents do have an HLMI that is 70 or above, it means that 40% don't have that. And in fact, we've got almost a quarter of the employees who have responded to the survey who have an HLMI that sits below 60. And that's basically the threshold that we would start talking about an obstructor environment, where essentially the environment that you're working in is really not helping you. It's more so working as an obstructor for the work that you're currently doing. Moving on, then looking at another one of our main KPIs, which is the question around productivity. And here I first want to make it clear that we do not measure productivity as such. We also don't ask people whether they are productive. Instead, what we ask them is, does your environment enable you to work productively? And the current stat for home environments, we see that 78% of respondents say that their home environment enables them to work productively, which is in fact quite a lot higher than what the equivalent score is for all the offices that we've measured. And actually the home productivity score is pretty much almost on the decimal at the same level as the productivity score across all those high performing workplaces that have achieved the Leesman Plus certification to date. But again, I really want to emphasize that averages can mask highs and lows. And we have seen quite some differences between organizations and also within different organizations. So this chart here shows you basically the HLMI, the overall HLMI for all those 14 different surveys that we've done. We see that the average, there is a bit of a range between the average across the different surveys, although generally they are fairly at a high level. But it becomes even more interesting when we look at the highs and the lows within each of those organizations. So here now the top of the bar shows you what the highest HLMI for any department or function within that organization was. And the bottom of the bar shows you what the lowest recorded HLMI for any of the departments or functions within that organization is. And so you'll see that within certain organizations, really there was a really significant difference between how employees from different functions were basically experiencing their home working. But let's then have a look at some more detailed numbers. And these are the 10 impact statements or impact question statements that Tim mentioned we have. Basically how this, or how to read this is, you'll see the chart in the bars, you see the exact responses that we received. So people have responded to the question on a scale from disagree strongly to agree strongly. And at the end of the chart, you see the agreement percentage, which is essentially the proportion of people who have either agreed slightly, agreed, or agreed strongly with the particular statement. And I want to highlight a few of these statements and a few of these results here, starting off with the three top ones. which essentially show us or tell us or suggest to us that generally the digital environment seems to be doing pretty well. Employees seem to have the access to the software applications, to the programs, to the IT devices and tools, to the information that they need as they're now working from home. So you'll see that all of those scores are closer to 80 or even the top one there, almost 90% of employees have agreed with that statement. If we then shift our focus to the bottom end of the chart and look at the bottom two, it becomes quite clear that the biggest challenges currently are more so in feeling connected. So 65% feel that they are connected to their organization, while only just under 60% say that they, now that they're working from home, they feel connected to their colleagues. So clearly, that's the main challenges currently. Another one that I want to flag is the 1/3 from the bottom. When I work from home, I am able to maintain a healthy work-life balance. Before, or I think as we were transitioning to home working, there was a lot of discussion about whether, is it on the one hand, does it make it easier to manage work-life balance because you don't have that commute to the office, saves you time, it's more time that you can spend on doing other things. And then on the other hand, the other side of the coin is that because there is no commute, it may be challenging for people to basically actually start and finish their workday. And there's a risk that some employees may just kind of work even more than they would do otherwise and end up in a situation where they're basically constantly switched on and never really finish work for the day. And our stats are showing that 2/3 seem to be able to manage this pretty well, while that still leaves 1/3 of the population saying that now that they're working from home, they're not able to maintain a healthy work-life balance. I'll move on then to looking at the activities. So as Tim mentioned, we kept the exact same list of 21 activities as we have in the office survey, for the simple reason that it on one hand, it makes for really interesting comparisons. On the other hand, also, we can assume that work as such, what you're aiming for, what your role is about, shouldn't really change just because you are working from home. Some things about how you do it may change, but generally the work that you do has not really changed. And the way to read this chart is essentially that the length of the bar for any of these activities shows you the volume of importance. So it shows you how many employees selected that particular activity to be important. And then the color coding of that bar shows you to what extent that particular activity is perceived to be supported. And you've got the more exact stats at the end. So importance is the proportion of people who said important, and supported is the equivalent. And with this one, I would like you to focus on what are the things that are important, what are the things that are perhaps less important. And if we look at the top part of this chart, we see that number one most important activity, individual focused work. And to be honest, that's no news whatsoever. It is the number one most important activity in every single survey we do. It doesn't matter if it's a home working survey or an office survey, it's always the most important activity because all of us really do individual focused work. And I'm going to come back to that further down in the presentation. And then we can look at what comes after that. So the other really important activities or important activities that are important to many people are then planned meetings, collaborating on focused work, and followed then by video conferences. If we then focus on the bottom part of this chart, we see which activities are then currently rated not to be so important in employees' roles. And perhaps not that surprisingly, hosting visitors, clients, or customers is currently not selected to be important by all that many people. Even though I would argue we're still doing some of that, but we're just doing it digitally. So for example, we are hosting you guys at the moment, even though we're not welcoming you to our particular office. So I think it's an activity that still will remain important for some people, even though it's done quite differently at this point. I will then swap around those bars. So now they've been reordered based on the proportion of red versus green. So essentially now you've got at the top, you've got those activities that are best supported proportionally. And then at the bottom, you have those activities that are proportionally poorest supported. And if, again, we start by focusing on the top part of this chart, we see that the activities that are best supported, audio conferences, planned meetings, video conferences. So it's a lot of different types of conversations. And then if we focus on what is, on the other hand, at the bottom of the bar, it becomes quite clear that it's the social interaction and collaborating and learning from others that is more challenged. So we've got learning from others and informal social interaction as the two longer bars towards the bottom of the chart. Again, though, we do see some differences between different organizations and how well these activities are supported. And this now shows you basically the range between the highest score that we recorded in any of the organizations and the lowest score across any of the organizations. So basically, furthest to the left, you'll see that, for example, audio conferences, even the organization that got the poorest score on this activity is still sitting at pretty much 90% support. Well, as we move on towards the right-hand side of this, this chart, you will see that there's a lot more a distribution between the scores that have been received. So, for example, learning from others, while the best score received was over 70%, the poorest result sat at 30%. So just showing how perhaps a matter of culture or leadership or so forth, it is and ways of basically facilitating learning from others. There are some quite wide ranges or wide differences between the results that organizations have received. I then wanted to flag a few activities where it's actually quite interesting to look at how the importance has changed when we compare it to the office data that we have. And starting off with video conferencing, we all know that currently we're doing quite a lot of it. And quite interestingly, before COVID-19, if we look at our entire office database, only 37% said that video conferences is important, which to some extent basically gives us a bit of an indication of perhaps how prepared organizations and how prepared employees were to this new way of working where all communication or most communication is happening through video conferences instead of in the office. So as you see, the importance currently then across the 14 organizations who have done the survey, a lot higher than what we saw previously. And to be honest, even here, we see a big variety or big range in the scores. So some organizations have had 70–80% of employees saying video conferences is important. And then some organizations have had lower scores on that. And generally, as was mentioned, we do see that this is working pretty well for employees as they're working from home. So 93% currently saying that video conferences is well supported as they are working from home. And I think this is important to keep in mind as we're thinking about both the short-term return to the office and also the long-term workplace strategy, because I don't think that video conferences is going to go back to an importance of 37%. It's now a new way of keeping in touch with people. And I do think that that is going to stay to some extent, perhaps not at the same level as now that we're all working from home. But I don't think that people will completely unlearn the way of keeping in touch and having meetings over video conferences. And especially not in that near normal period where you have some of your employees back in the office, some employees still working from home, and they still need to keep in touch, most likely through video conferencing. And so it's worth thinking about what sort of pressure does that put on the office environment, as employees will be coming back with a much higher expectation or a much higher need for things like video conferencing compared to what they had when before COVID-19. Another activity that I wanted to flag in terms of importance is telephone conversations, mainly because the pattern there is almost the opposite. So before COVID, 69% said that telephone conversations is important to them as a part of their role. And currently, actually, we're seeing a lower importance score on that. And my best guess or speculation on this is simply that it's the video conferencing that has almost taken over the telephone conversations. So we're more prone to video conference each other than we are to, actually calling each other. And I can certainly say that from a personal perspective that that's what happened within our team. I can't even remember when was the last time I called one of my colleagues, because we're constantly connected through Zoom instead, and we video conference each other instead. And clearly people are though experiencing that if they do have to make phone calls, it is really working well at home. So almost 92% say that that's supported. And that is quite significantly better than what the scores have been in office environments previously. Generally, we do quite often see that telephone conversations, it is a little bit of a challenge in workplaces. And it's quite crucial also because it is an activity that has a quite strong link to other activities as well. So if telephone conversations isn't supported, then actually it might have also a negative effect on things like focused work, if the assumption then is that people who do telephone conversations or speak on the phone, they're forced to do that in same spaces where people are trying to focus. And you essentially end up with a poor experience on telephone conversations, and you end up with a poor experience of individual work as well. The last activity that I wanted to flag, I mentioned this briefly already earlier, is individual focused work. And there we see that the importance hasn't really changed. It was important before, it's still just as important. So the fact that we are now working from home hasn't changed the fact that individual focused work really is kind of the hygiene factor of work. It's something that pretty much every single employee does at some point during their workday or work week. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. What there is a bit of a difference in currently is that home environments are supporting it pretty well. So 87% say that that's supported, which is pretty much 10 percentage points higher than what we have recorded in the office environment previously. Then if we collect together just to look at another comparison between the office environments and the home environments based on support. So how well these activities are supported and where we find the biggest gaps between the home experience and the office experience. These are the 4 activities that are basically have the biggest gap in favor of the home environment. So as you see, it's all about different types of conversations. Currently very well supported throughout with quite large differences between the home experience and the average office experience. But not everything gets better scores in the office, in the home environment. These are the 4 activities with the biggest gap in favor of the office. And as you see, the one we touched upon earlier, hosting visitors, clients, and customers, the one with the biggest gap in favor of the office. And then the 2 other ones that we talked about, learning from others and informal social interaction, which is something that it is difficult or more challenging to support now that people are working from home. And I think it's important to keep this in mind as well when we're thinking about when people start returning to the office. This is what they're used to, or this is what they're used to experiencing in the office environment and in their workplaces. For many years, we've been designing workplaces with a focus to support bringing people together and allowing people to interact and learn from each other and so forth. And that is essentially the expectation that people will most likely have when they come back to the office, because that's what they're missing at home, and that's what they're used to having when they have been in the office. I'm then going to move on to the features section. So as Tim mentioned, we have a much shorter list of different features in this survey. So 11 of them in total. And this chart works again in the exact same way as chart for activities. So the length of the bar shows you the volume of importance, how many people said that it was important. And then the color coding shows you how satisfied they were with that feature. And again, let's focus first on what's at the top, what's at the bottom. So we see the four main things with a quite similar level of importance is basically desk, chair, Wi-Fi, and mobile computing equipment. At the bottom, then, we see that it's a much smaller proportion of employees who are currently still relying on fixed computing equipment and a wired network connectivity. And also, third from the bottom, telephone equipment, which I think is quite aligned with the fact that telephone conversations has seen a decrease in importance. And if we then swap those around, now we have the features with the highest satisfaction at the top and the ones with the lowest at the bottom. And again, if we look at the top, start by looking at the top, we see that it is to a large extent the digital environment. So whoever within these organizations have been in charge of basically mobilizing and providing a digital infrastructure that enables people to work from home. And they have clearly done a good job. So the digital environment doesn't seem to be the issue at the moment. If we then focus on the bottom part, we see that the longest bar towards the bottom is chair. And that's something certainly anecdotally you hear from a bit here and there, that after months now of working from home from a chair that is not perhaps suitable for work, people are starting to feel it in their backs. Another one at the bottom, then, printing, copying, and scanning equipment. I will get back to that one, but essentially, as you see, that's the one feature that has the lowest satisfaction score overall. So if we then pick out a few features and again compare the importance of those to what the importance of them was pre-COVID across the 740 office respondents. Computing equipment mobile, we see that only 60% actually said that it was important before. And I think that kind of gives us, again, a little bit of an indication of the starting point that organizations had as people, all of a sudden, everyone was working from, or moved and relocated and started working from home. And as you can see, of course, now that we're working from home, the importance of mobile and computing equipment has quite drastically increased. And it's been done well, though. We can see that high satisfaction scores on that. So 85% are satisfied with their mobile computing equipment now, compared to 68% across the global database. Another one I want to flag, again, in terms of importance, remote access to work files or networks. Only 53% said that that was important pre-COVID. And again, that perhaps gives a bit of an indication of to what extent people were working from home. It's quite aligned with those numbers that we pulled earlier on. And just shows that not all organizations were necessarily completely equipped and ready for all employees working from home. And in terms of getting access to files and networks also outside of the corporate workplace. And of course, that is now a lot more important. So nearly 80% have said that that is important now that they're working from home. But again, we do see that it seems as if organizations have been able to react to this. So over 80% are satisfied with their access to work files or networks now that they are working remotely. And then the last feature I wanted to flag was the one mentioned earlier, printing, copying, and scanning equipment, where pre-COVID, 67% said that that is important to them. And 45% now say that it is important. And I was kind of reflecting on this 67% before we started getting the home working data and thinking about whether with the assumption that not all people are going to have printing, copying, and scanning equipment at home, is this an opportunity for employees and for organizations to perhaps go a little bit more paperless than they have before? And what we're seeing now is the importance, at least across those 14 organizations that we've worked with now, the importance of printing, copying, and scanning is in fact lower than what it was overall before. And I think the assumption that not many people have this equipment at home is quite right, as we see that even less than 20% are satisfied with it at home. So again, I would see this one perhaps as an opportunity for organizations to take that leap towards working a little bit more paperless than before, basically as a consequence of employees being forced to do it, and having tried that at least now for a few months. So then if we again do a bit of a comparison between satisfaction scores in the office, in the workplaces versus the home experience, again, these are the features where the gap is the largest in favor of the home environment currently. So as you'll see, again, they're all digital environment features where we see big satisfaction differences between what basically represents the average workplace previously and now the organizations that have done the survey. But again, not everything is better at home, and these are the features that have a much better score or have a better score in the workplace. So the first one, the obvious one, printing, copying, and scanning, and then followed by chair and desk, where it's basically we're seeing much better score in the office and office data than what we are seeing now as people are working from home. And perhaps also worth noting on this slide that the fourth biggest gap is on fixed computing equipment, but at that point the gap is only 6 percentage points, so not as significant as what we saw in the other way around when comparing what's better at home. So those are general scores. We've then done a little bit of a digging around and looked at the experience differences based on various different demographics. So as Tim mentioned, we have a number of demographic questions that sit in the beginning of the survey, and we ask things like age and gender and length of service and so forth. And one of the comparisons that we were quite interested and keen to look at was the comparison of age groups. And this is basically the trend that we typically see in our office data. So generally, you can say that the younger an employee is, typically, on average, the better their experience is of the work environment. And then the older you get, the poorer your experience. And our best explanation really to this has been that if you are young, you're in the beginning of your career, you don't have as much responsibilities, you have a more narrow activity profile, you do less different things, which also then means that it's easier for the workplace to support those things that you're doing. And as you get older and you get more experience and you perhaps climb the ladder and get more responsibility, you need more from the environment and your experience decreases. So then as we had our first data on this, I was quite keen to see what it looked like. And the very first pattern that we started identifying was something along this line. So essentially what we were seeing is that it was basically the complete reverse in the home environment. So the older you were, the better your experience. And I honestly thought that was amazing because it looks quite neat, and just to see that pattern is just, I don't know, from a data perspective, I think it's quite beautiful. However, as we've added more data, unfortunately, that beautiful pattern that we were seeing is gone. And currently with the 10,000 respondents, there's not really we can't clearly say that younger employees are having a poor experience, older employees are having a better experience. It's been blurred out a bit. And actually, as you see, the HLMIs are actually quite similar and at the same level across these different age groups. So I'm not going to go into more detail on comparisons between these age groups. I think we just simply need to sit back and wait for more data to come in and then do more meaningful comparisons after that. One comparison, though, that has that really shows a very clear pattern, and that pattern has pretty much just been reinforced the more data we have collected, is the experience based on the type of environment that you have at home. So in the survey, we asked whether you have a dedicated workroom or office at home. if you have a dedicated work area, which basically is a space where you work, but it's not actually a separate room, or if you basically work from an area that is actually not meant for working at all. So it is your dining table, your couch, your whatever, your lounge area or so forth, but it's not actually just specifically for working. And this is where we see a very clear difference in the HLMI and the overall home experience. So those with a dedicated room by far have a much higher HLMI, a better experience compared to those in the bottom group here who work from a space that is actually not meant or not designed and not allocated for working. And we need to be mindful that this group is still a significant proportion of the employees. So 1/3 of the employees who responded to this basically work from a non-work specific location at home. So again, coming back to that, the overall experience is pretty good, but that doesn't apply to, or that is not true for everyone. We then had a bit more of a detailed comparison between these different work settings. And what you see here now is the 10 impact questions and the agreement score for each of these 3 settings that you work from at home. And just generally what you'll see is that the column on the right has the lowest scores throughout. So those who don't have a designated place to work at home, they have the lowest experience or poorest experience with in regards to all of these different statements. But I want to flag and highlight just a few of them. So first of all, perhaps the most obvious one, there's a very big gap in whether they feel that the physical settings that they use when they're working from home are suitable for working. Another one, quite interestingly, the productivity question. We have a more than a 20 percentage point gap between those with a private office at home versus those who just work from anywhere. And I think this is very much also strongly linked to the fact that we have a 20 percentage point gap in how these 2 groups perceive that individual focused work is supported. And individual work is something that we have in our earlier research linked very closely to the productivity question. So whether one feels that the environment enables you to work productively is very much driven by whether you perceive that your individual activities are supported. And the last one that I wanted to flag is the one about work-life balance. And also here we see quite a big gap between those, especially those who don't have a workroom or work area at home versus those who have a specific office. And I think there's something around the fact that if you are working from the same areas where you also socialize and eat and watch TV and so forth, it's quite easy to lose that clear threshold between, or clear cut between, my workday is finished, I'm now gonna basically relax and not do work. And instead you may end up in this always on or always switched on type of mentality. So large difference there between those then who have an office where they can just get up and close the door, and that's their work day for the day. We've also done comparisons based on some other background questions that we have. So one of the questions we have is about who is present when you're working from home. And here in this question, as you may notice from the fact that the bars add up to more than 100, you can select multiple options. And very preliminarily, if we look at the experience scores on this, we see that those with a flatmate or a friend or other people around, they have the lowest score, lowest experience or poorest experience, while those who have no one around have the highest experience. But this one, with this question, I think it's really early days. We want to do some more digging around in this and basically looking at different combinations. I'm particularly keen to look at whether, for example, if you have children around, does it have an impact on then if you also have a partner who's there and basically sharing the responsibility to perhaps look after the children? Or another cut would be interesting to look at having children around versus your age group, because I think we can say that if you are older, you are more likely to have children who are slightly older, And then if you are younger, your children are likely to be a bit younger, and in that case might need more attention and looking after compared to those with older children in the house. But more on this also to come as we collect more data. So basically then to sum up, and as I've said on a previous call as well, I'm not going to call these conclusions. I think it's too early for conclusions. I prefer to call them observations. Generally, we can say that on average, employees' working experience as they are working from home is relatively good. Generally, it's activities such as different sort of conversations that are being supported very well at the moment, while then the main challenges are in feeling connected to your colleagues, to your organization, social interaction, learning from others. We think there may be differences in the home working experience based on certain demographics, but we need to wait and see and get more data on this one. I originally thought that we were going to say something around age group differences, but really had to take that one back until we get more data and can really analyze that pattern. But instead, what is becoming quite evident is that what sort of setting you have at home is a very strong predictor of your experience of working from home. And then as we're thinking about both the short-term returning to the office and getting people to return to the office in the short term, and also as we're thinking about what should the long-term workplace strategy look like, as evident as it seems, basically whether people will want to be working in the office short-term or long-term kind of depends on both what you're offering them in the office, so what their experience is of the workplace, and on the other hand, how that compares to what the experience they have working from home. So those two basically need to be taken into consideration as we're looking forward. And then also want to flag the fact that ways of working are likely to have changed to some extent. So we may be doing some things differently, like video conferencing, and we need to be mindful of what does that mean in terms of what the office should support also in the future. And then likewise, expectations might have changed. So things that people didn't know to appreciate before, they perhaps didn't know what they had until it was gone. So it could be that there are certain things in the office environment that people are now experiencing more so than ever. And also the other way around, there may be things that we're currently having such a good experience of at home that our expectation on that particular same thing as we return to the office is basically going to have increased. So on that note, I will now hand back to Tim to talk about, well, what does this all mean and what are the implications then for future workplace strategies?
Thanks, Peggy. Right, so I think the overriding thing there, and I like the way Peggy said she couldn't see a pattern in the age demographics. What it meant was she couldn't see the pattern she wanted to see or liked to see there, or that it had changed. But that does give you an indication of how much the data is skewing around and moving every time a live survey closed. So there was a pattern, it's flat. Everybody's got the same experience based on the data we have today. But as we outlined at the beginning, there's more than 30,000 respondents in live surveys currently. The picture may change tomorrow. So for as long as those findings are highly variable, and it talks a lot, I think, to the sort of world that we're all living in, which is actually the news is changing every day on the situation that we're having to cope with. So what we would really caution is some of these sort of heat of the moment, faddish responses to the situation we're in at the moment. Almost every organization has got itself through the crisis management phase superbly well, especially from a technology infrastructure perspective, as Peggy's data shows you. But I think what we should be focusing on now is the return to office strategy, and then the long tail out and the future role of workplace. So let's just think about that for a moment. This was a model that we presented a couple of years back around a CIA model, control, influence, or accept. And what we outlined here was the things that were fully in the workplace arenas, control, workplace, and the process design. Then the things in the center ground where you could exercise some influence as workplace and real estate professionals, and stuff at the other end where actually often you just had to accept it. But I think what COVID-19 has done for us all is really dramatically change that model, because actually our experience has been totally blended. Because we're having our experiences bombarded with newness and differentness every day, the trip to the supermarket or the grocery store, more deliveries at home, implications of public transport and all the social distancing stuff, that suddenly actually experience is front and center of everybody's mind. And I think this is something that we really need to think about from a workplace perspective. And I think an amazing time if you're in a role that encompasses employee experience, because suddenly every one of your colleagues is going to be looking at you to think and design that employee experience proposition for those employees as they come back. Now, this is another piece of research. This is from the same period, 2 years ago. All of this available on the website, but this looked at employee sentiment. And it looked at what things have to be provided well in order for you to influence sentiment, and which things impacted most on those sentiment expressions. So you might want to look back at this one. The stuff at the middle of this visualization is the stuff that has a bigger impact on an employee's sentiment expression than the stuff at the peripheries. And if it's off this map, it's not directly statistically influencing those sentiment expressions. So there are 13 drivers that cross all three of the lines on the visualization. We call those our sentiment super drivers. These are the key influencing factors of what employees think about their day at a workplace. Now, I would I suggest you sort of contemplate these in terms of what they mean from a work experience perspective, regardless of the place. Because while some of them may be more in control for an employee working from home, some of them are way beyond their control, and as per Peggy's data, are already highly depleted. Learning from others, relaxing, taking a break, positions 2 and 3 in terms of the volume of influence on those sentiment drivers. Thinking and creative thinking, also seeing some issues there, fracture lines around the ability for colleagues to collaborate around creative content. So I would urge you also to go back and refamiliarize yourself with the sentiment map that we produced back then. Now, this piece of research, a little bit older than that, but this crosses over with a couple of the questions that I've seen coming through, and a point or question made by Ian Brackley around, where was it, around the volume of importance associated with certain creative or collaborative tasks. Just a real point of clarity, Peggy made it very quickly on a couple of points, or a couple of the charts. We don't ask employees to rank activities by importance. They simply tell us which activities are important to them. So you've got a volume of importance across a population. They're not actually being asked to shuffle things up to say whether they're more important or less important. So this was an exercise that we did that looked at how well a workplace supported individual activities versus how it supported collaborative activities, to see what impact that was having on the overall performance of a workplace. Now, unsurprisingly and almost patently obviously, if a workplace doesn't support individual activity or collaborative, it sits down here in the bottom left-hand corner of this model as an obstructor workplace, a low performance experience workplace. That's blindingly obvious, right? In the top right-hand corner, equally as obvious, if a workplace can support collaborative activity and individual activity, it's high performance, and it's one of our catalyst workplaces. This is where we would see all of our Leesman plus high performers in that segment. The surprise, though, we're in the other two corners. So workplaces that supported collaborative activities well, but didn't support individual activities, were still delivering low scores. Whereas those that were supporting individual focused activity well, but not the collaborative, were just hovering underneath the catalyst territory. So delivering higher scores than those that only supported the collaborative. And one of the conclusions we drew from this, that when many organizations were consuming the sort of content you'd see in Harvard Business Review that says collaborate, collaborate, collaborate at all costs, and actually they were over-baking the collaboration at the expense of the individual focus. And I think this brings, in one of our sort of myth-busting territories, brings into question some of the chatter that's going on across industry platforms around the idea of a hub and spoke model, where the corporate workplace is purely for collaborative or creative activity, and the home is the better place for individual and focused activity. That's sort of, at a very simplistic level, what the data might be suggesting if you don't go deeper. Because what I would argue is it's not so much about the meeting that we need to be thinking about, it's the 5 minutes before and the value of the 15 minutes afterwards. And how this sort of, the concept of target fixation, don't focus purely on what's happening in the meeting, think about the stuff around the edges. So it's not what happens on a Zoom call, It's actually the stuff that you're not overhearing when you're just wandering around an open workplace with colleagues, working away, beavering away there. So this is the thing that I really want to us all to think about really finely, the detail about the value proposition that a workplace has in that sort of mixed collage. We have 21 activities. On the original list when we designed Leesman, or when we were doing the concept, there might have been 100 activities on there. You can't ask employees about 100, but there's other stuff going on that's much more difficult to measure that you must not forget in these future developments of strategy. And this gives you another little insight into some of that in terms of the value of the face-to-face communication. This was a tiny exercise we looked at based on just 2 clients who happened to have face-to-face IT help desk in some buildings and virtual help desk in the others, right? So client A, client B, virtual help desk satisfactions in client A, 45% satisfaction, in client B, 40% satisfaction. Just check the difference that happens when you bring that virtual service into a face-to-face realm in the office space itself. More than double the satisfaction figures for those employees who are experiencing it face-to-face. This is the stuff that you must remember in terms of the value of workplace and the value of being together versus the potentially efficient proposition of being dispersed for some time. The other thing I'd urge you to think about is that organizations did not enter this crisis in equal stature, right, with equal skill sets. They entered with very different susceptibilities and very different strengths. So these were just 2 examples that I pulled from Peggy's research last year on our Leesman Plus spaces. So these are high performance workplaces, one of them doing it at 7.5 square meters per person, occupant density, the other running at 40.3. Now, with a caveat on the 40.3 that they were not yet fully occupied. This was a workplace designed for future expansion. But if you were to simply take a 20% reduction in occupant density across those 2 spaces, it's a very different experience for the 2 populations. You can easily socially distance in the second, very difficult to socially distance in the first, even with a 20% headcount reduction on your first wave of return. So you're going to have to do the hard work. This is the time for strategists to really do the strategy work in terms of the numbers and the math and actually get workplaces working and refueled. So please avoid the cookie cutter, cut and paste type propositions that are being banded around. We don't think they're healthy. So Peggy doesn't get off the fence unless she's got the data that gets her off the fence too. Although there are a few more opinions creeping in as she presents this, I've noticed. It's normally my realm to do the wide-ranging opinion pieces. So the first one of my big opinions is organizations have suddenly granted a whole heap of trust to employees that historically they didn't trust. They handed them laptops and trusted them to go and work in remote locations unseen. You cannot simply snatch that back the minute that employees are returning to office without huge impacts on your employee engagement. So I'd really urge you to think about some of the softer, more empathetic, emotional intelligence type issues you're going to face as we long tail out of COVID and as you start to attract employees back to the workplace. And I do believe strongly that they'll want to come back to the workplace. But what I do think in that long tail and beyond, this will absolutely heighten the debate around the value of assigned versus unassigned seating strategies. And there, what I would suggest you do is look back at Peggy's research from the last 2 years worth of Leesman Plus spaces to look at the things around the value of things like neighborhood systems. You are clearly, as we come out of this into the sort of economic mire that the world will be in, you will all be under pressure to save real estate costs. And so the easy snap decision is to go to unassigned, but yet you know that from a biosecurity perspective and an employee anxiety perspective, you're better off going assigned seating strategies. So I think you should expect this debate to be massive over the next 3 to 4 months as we try and work out what the hell's going on. Right, noise is a productivity killer. This was one of the first super stats that came out of Leesman early doors. We know that a dissatisfaction with noise levels is the principal driver of reduced productivity, the highest correlation to an employee not agreeing that their workplace supports them working productively. And to Peggy's point, what we also know is that employees are going to come back to the workplace expecting to video conference the minute somebody dials in. And so they're going to be doing that in these open landscape environments. And we think acoustics is going to be another massive problem. It's been a problem since we first reported it around about 7 years ago. And I would really urge any designer on the call, I think there's some Ecophon people on the call, you've really got to start banging the drum about this. I think office acoustics is going to be a massive problem and a massive issue to debate. And it needs to come back up the agenda and be top of the agenda in any new design schemes. And think about the impact of employees just, dialing into a call. If they've got headphones on and they're speaking on a headset, even worse because the voices are amplified because they can't hear themselves with the cans on. So some big issues, I think, brewing around workplace acoustics. Right, onto some of the softer stuff. You cannot diarize serendipity, right? It's not possible. I don't believe it and I don't buy it. You know, you can have your daily stand-ups, you can have your quiz every second week on Zoom, fine. But I think the value proposition around people being together, accidental bumping ins, overhearings, is something none of us can measure properly, regardless of what tech you think you've bedded in or what observational analysis you do. And I think the impact on the younger generations of reduced learning around the social interaction is also starting to create some fracture lines. The younger employees in some of the early surveys we've done and some of the local ones that I've been debriefing organizations on are showing that our younger demographic are really lacking that learning from other proposition. And I believe they're probably thinking their career development is on hold. Now, if their career development is on hold, so is organizational development. So I really think you need to start value propositioning that stuff about being together, the social glue, the secret sauce, the fairy dust that's sprinkled on employees when they come back to the workplace, and especially the younger ones. Right, avoid the binary decision making. A classic example from a call a couple of weeks ago, presenting to some data to a client who has inbound and outbound contact centers. Do not mass them as one. The impact for an inbound contact center, if you're on the receiving end of an RC call from a client, from a customer who's got issues that you're trying to resolve, when you come off that call is very different from an employee perspective to an employee who's making an outbound call. So really, just in that, even that tiny realm, please be thoughtful and empathetic towards the actual role that an employee is doing for you in their employment. And that's why I think for me, it's the role and the work that they're doing is critical. And that's how you're going to prove the value proposition of workplace going forward. Whether that's at home, because to Peggy's point, for some roles and for some people, depending on the space that they have or their demography, that actually home is working pretty well. But for a whole heap of other people, and in the presentations that I've been giving to clients, certainly around creative tasks and high intellectual capital tasks, seeing legal departments languishing at the bottom of those floating bar charts that Peggy presented you with, I think there are issues in that realm that we're going to have to look very deeply for in that next glut of data. So really go deep in understanding the role and how the role is supported before you make any sweeping decisions about the future of workplace in your organization. So look, all of the research that I've touched on, and progressively we will get published, the research that Peggy's taken you on, will be on the website. It's already there if we've done it. Go and rummage around, look back at the experience documents, the Leesman Plus documents. The Leesman Review is also there, our quarterly journal. I think the last one, suddenly, pre-COVID, looks really quite relevant. The idea of preparing your team for anything and rewriting the rule book. This was an interview with David Mackay, an American submarine captain. Really good read. And Beth will have the next one out for you in the next couple of weeks. Again, written predominantly before COVID, and actually looking at the high emotional intelligence organization and the impact of empathy in your engagement with employees. So again, funnily enough, 2 editions that are even more pertinent to the challenges that we face today. So as usual, we've overrun, but as I said, we're not going anywhere. So look, more than happy to answer as many questions as we've got in that we can get through in the next 30 minutes. So if you need to duck off, Beth will send you a link to the recording. If you need a PDF copy, I've seen all the requests for PDFs coming in, those have all been banked, but if you'd like a PDF copy, reach out to your Leesman contact or to one of us and we'll get it to you. Thank you for joining us, but if you don't need to disappear and you want to hang out for a little bit longer and answer some more questions or participate in the debate, please hang around. We've got about another 30 minutes that we're going to be here. So thank you for those who need to go away, and shout if you need anything.
Excellent, thanks. I'm going to start, as you mentioned, we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to start diving in. There's a question around the data. Sorry, I've just lost my place. Here we go. So the organizations, you mentioned we've got 14 organizations included in the data. So someone's asking, Daniel's asking, excuse me, is it just real estate and workplace specialists taking the Leesman Index survey? Because that might be different if you compare it to what you might normally get. So can you talk a little bit about who the data is coming from?
Yeah, so was it Daniel you said? Asked the question, Alison?
Yes, that's correct.
So, well, there will be some real estate professionals in there because they'll be in the departments that have bought into the survey, but you're probably talking about a couple of handfuls, I would think, across the whole sample. There are no real estate companies in there. There are no brokers in there. It's all clients doing things as diverse as online gaming. I mentioned Hanro when we came from PokerStars is one of the samples. There's a design and build contractor in there. There's an investment broker. There's all sorts of organizations. So it's pretty diverse across that group. The next glut of data has a whole heap of financial services clients, hugely dispersed from Southeast Asia across to the Americas. So we're getting more diversity as we go. But yeah, no real estate companies in there per se at the moment. So a very dispersed splattering of different professions and sectors.
Great, thanks. A couple other questions on the data. So are there any connections between age and dedicated workroom or office?
Yeah, I can take that one. And that was basically the assumption that we had at first when we were seeing that clear pattern, that essentially younger employees are more likely to have flatmates, to be working from not having access to a private room or private office that works as their the place where they work when they work from home, but instead basically being stuck working from a dining table in a place where they have other people around as well. So I do think that was the explanation, or what basically gave some, explained some of the trend or pattern that we were seeing in the beginning. But as mentioned, now the age group comparison pattern has kind of flattened out a bit. So it's impossible to say in that sense, but I do think that there is some sort of connection there, but it remains to be seen as we get more data.
I think it's interesting, the questions from Maria, who's probably might well be sitting in her summer cottage somewhere in Sweden right now. So I think it's a really interesting question, Maria, that also crosses geographic boundaries. So in that 30,000 or so data points in there, there's a whole heap from Hong Kong, also from Central and Southeast Asia, other locations that I think are going to have very different domestic accommodation for employees than some of the data that we already have. So a picture that's very much fluctuating, I think, across the globe based on country, as well as by age or by family grouping profile. So that's one thing I suspect. My instinct there is that we won't see stability on those numbers until we pass the sort of 70 to 100,000 responses on those types of numbers. We really need to go quite deep, I think, and carefully in those territories before we start reporting.
Excellent, thanks. We've got a question from Ian around work activities and specifically looking at creativity. That's commonly held as a reason to have an office, and it's ranked as low importance in the survey. How could that be boosted?
Yeah, so I touched on this slightly, Alison, in terms of Ian. It's only ranked lower by volume of importance. So 36% of employees in the home working survey ranking it as an important activity. My hypothesis here is, rather than suddenly workplaces being sort of creative hubs, is they are where you would go to be creative, they actually become the place for the creatives. So that in terms of the value proposition of real estate, they are valued more for activities that offices are better at supporting than homes are better at supporting, also based on your co-location with colleagues of a similar role profile. And I know we're running over a bit on time, but I'll give you a tiny little anecdote just to put this into a sort of little bit of perspective. I hate theme parks. I can't stand roller coasters, right? Now, when my kids were growing up, it was like, let's go to Legoland for some fun. Yeah, right, let's go to Legoland, but it sure ain't fun if I'm going on the roller coasters. So the idea of you designing workplaces purely for creative, where you would send people to be creative, I don't get. I don't think that will work. But I do think for those people who want fun, go to the theme park. So for those people who are creatives, go to creative hubs where you can exchange with your co-creatives and with your high intellectual transfer work. So I think if there is a change to the nature of work in the future, or workplace in the future, I think it will be more about us being super focused on the specialist nature of some of the roles within an organization, and more design attention onto the purposeful support of those roles in those locations.
Excellent, thanks. I'm going to jump to Hanro's question. He's saying that, spending time in the office and time working at home is the new normal, being predicted by many. What's your view on where it might land? And is there any points to support your view? So, a home office split perhaps for the workforce.
Can I take that one?
Well, I go and find the crystal ball and see what it says.
Yeah, exactly. I would say it depends, to the point that whether an employee is better off doing some of their activities at home or in the office, it depends on the office, and it depends on the home. So I don't think that there is an exact ratio that that we can kind of aim for. I think the key is more about giving employees choice and the ability to basically have control of their work day and work week, and do the things, do all their activities in the space that, or in the place that supports them best. So I'm skeptical about kind of finding a golden percentage that would work for anyone. It depends on organization, depends on the individual, depends on the offices, depends on the homes, and so forth. I
think also to the point that I made, that organizations entered this crisis with very, very different strengths and weaknesses. And you know, Hanro, our first ever Leesman index client, entered the crisis, Hanro, with a pretty awesome portfolio with some high performance buildings and employees who enjoyed the places that you're providing. I think what's interesting is that all of our early adopters, or most of the early adopters in that 14 clients are in already, have a high awareness of employee experience. I think, you know, if it's already wired into your organization to be aware and supportive of employee experience, you probably mobilized much faster and much better in terms of distributed working. You have management culture that would trust employees to work at distance. Whereas organizations perhaps that haven't yet started, although I think we've got a few coming through in the next wave of surveys, where clients are now suddenly recognizing the importance of experience where perhaps they haven't before, can be very, very interested to see their Leesman office survey results compared to their home working. Because what's happening now is that more clients are coming to us, and rather than just buying into the home working survey, are actually buying into the office survey with the home working survey attached as a module, so they can do that direct comparison and use the data to directly inform who would benefit the most from coming back earliest in terms of the re-entry strategies. So very much a case, I think, of how you entered the crisis will directly influence how you exit.
Good. We've got several questions in Q&A about where the data comes from. So are there differences between countries and regions? That's coming from Iris. Kaya is asking, the same, different in APAC versus Europe. So can you talk a little bit about where the data is coming from?
Yeah, the data currently represents everything from the Americas through Europe to Asia and or Asia Pacific. So it does come from all over. We have not yet done any country or regional comparison, just simply because even if we take the 10,000 respondents and cut them or slice them based on the 16 countries, you only end up with some 600 responses on average for each of the countries. And I don't think that is enough to make statements about how experience between different countries, what it looks like. So basically on that one, we will for sure do some regional comparisons once we have more data.
Great. Another data question from Sinead. Is there a marked difference in sector or type of organization between the high scoring and low scoring?
I think if I just give you Sinead, some sort of more anecdotal insights there, and then Peggy can perhaps talk from a more academic perspective. Certainly in the results presentations that I've been doing, I am seeing that the sort of creative and more collaborative and high intellectual capital work departments are tending to languish at the bottom of those floating bar charts that Peggy presented. So legal teams, creative teams, design teams, marketing teams. So I think if you have parts of organizations where creative and collaborative work or high problem solving type work, focused problem solving, where just hearing something in the periphery or being able to ask somebody, just spark a question rather than having to sort of dial into a structured Teams call, or you know, I think what I'm seeing there is that those groups are the ones that are less well supported by distributed working, whereas some of the more sort of process-based, metronomic type, you know, monthly cyclical work, perhaps in finance teams or administrative teams, is frankly pretty well supported by homes, notwithstanding all the comments Peggy made about the type of environment that you have available to you at the home. I think that the last comment I'd make on that, though, is that we also have to be aware that some of the decision makers at the moment are sat in their garden offices with their air conditioning plants and their multi-screen displays and they're nice there on Vitra chairs, making decisions about return to office strategies and future workplace strategies with little insight into the, the accommodation that some of their employees are having to contend with at home. So.
Thanks. Nick has a question about, I guess, management and how they need to adapt. So can you share your thoughts about how managers need to adapt in these changing times?
I think it sort of resonates with the point I made about organizations with, the high awareness of employee experience entering probably had that infrastructure based in. There was a question on the previous webinar around activity-based working, and Peggy and I both made points. Peggy can come back and amplify this, but our sense is that if you have adopted activity-based working properly, i.e. as a management strategy, you're probably very well equipped, and managers are already, if you like, have been through the process of managing and supporting distributed teams. Whereas those for whom this is new, I think, yeah, organizations have got to step up. And I think HR colleagues, organizational development colleagues are now going to have to be the sort of next wave behind the technologists who've enabled us to work remotely to make sure that is supported. And some of the tools that we're in the process of developing at the moment around a topic that we're calling or referring to as sort of creep. How do employees, does their sentiment start to drift away from the organization? I think this is the part now where we really need to understand as we stay out for longer what is happening to employees. But Peggy, do you want to?
Yeah, perhaps just add to that. I think the two of the really key words in that is, on one hand, trust that you talked about earlier. People have been giving trust now, and we can't take them back. So, managing with trust, I think will be more important than ever before. And then the other thing that relates to that is choice, and giving employees the choice of basically trusting them with the choice to design their work day and work week, and how and where they work. I think that's really going to be a key for the future.
Great. We've got a question from Phidias. Do we believe that the status of video against voice calls has changed? Do you think it differs for introverted employees over extroverts? And will we look at either type of call differently in the future?
I think, well, Peggy presented the numbers. Maybe she can remind them of us, but very loosely, I think what we're seeing, Phidias, is that the video calls have been replaced. The drop in telephone call volume of importance is almost equaled by the increase in video call importance. So I think what has happened is that suddenly organizations who perhaps historically didn't encourage the wide adoption of some of the new sort of enterprise tools, the Zoom, Teams type platforms with good UI, with good UX, suddenly we've got used to it, right? And I think, to Peggy's earlier point, I don't think that employees are suddenly going to go back to a handset on a curly cable anytime soon when they've experienced the quality of these types of interactions. I think it will put pressure, and I think where the technologists need to concentrate now their efforts, having mobilized so superbly to get employees working remotely, is the massive impact on Wi-Fi bandwidths when employees start returning to the office with these laptops that they've been given. Because at the home at the moment, it seems like everybody's pretty much doing pretty well on their $15 a month domestic connections. But if we all go back to the office and suddenly start Wi-Fiing on our devices and the systems collapse and can't maintain the bandwidth, then I think expect employee sentiment to drop off rapidly. Peggy, what's your view from a data perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we see it quite clearly in the data, as you mentioned, that video calls has increased, and I think it's quite natural because we know how important facial expressions and body posture and so forth is in communication, as a part of communication, and as you don't see your colleagues in between either. You basically, if you don't do video calls, you never see them. And it's really difficult to basically, based on just voice, read whether is your colleague, your teammate, your client having a bad day or so. So I do think that I think it's here to stay, and I hope that yeah, more organizations do realize the importance of video calls rather than just voice calls also in the future.
Thanks. Another question, but broadly looking at importance of activities. So this is from Thomas. Do you have any thoughts on the link between the importance individuals allocate to different activities and the actual value of those activities to the organization?
Thomas, I can tell you, from a data perspective, no, absolutely not. And it's also why I think a question that we've seen often used in the current debate around, do you feel more productive at home or less productive at home, is frankly not worth the screen space that it occupies on the survey, unless you go deeper and understand which activities you might be better supporting and which activities are worse supported. So the answer is no. I'm not sure most of the organizations that we're around fully understand that anyway. And I think there was a great comment made yesterday on one of the webinars around productivity, and responding to Peggy's data point that actually at the moment the agreement that your workspace supports you working productively is higher at home than it is generally across our office-based world. But one of the delegates yesterday made the point that the work that's being done now actually is impacting on the outcome of the organization 18 months or 2 years down the line. But actually, if you add to that we have no idea what economic climate we're coming out into, I think it's just way too complicated for us to generalize and to extrapolate from a data perspective. And the impact on some organizations is huge. One of my oldest relationship clients is on the call, publishing company. We first worked together when there was a volcano that erupted in Iceland and killed book sales at airports, right? And a lot of people going on holiday in the summer impulse buy books at airports, and suddenly you're not buying trade publications off of airports. Well, suddenly that's happening again. And so it's not about the quality of the publishing, it's not about the quality of the writing or the acquisition of new authors. It's suddenly completely out of your market control. So I think, those types of influencing factors are way too complicated for a simple workplace experience survey to try and comprehend. But I think organizations can do better and do more internally. But Peggy, anything from your academic perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I would even add the additional layer of complication in that even if there was some sort of connection there, we would be able to identify, it would look different for employees within an organization. So the monetary value of someone having a poor sales call might be completely different to the monetary value or value brought to an organization if a video call for someone else might not be well supported. So I think it would be extremely difficult to, in any way or form, basically set a value and say that certain activities are basically more important from the organizational value perspective than others. I think that for an employee, everything that they do is important to be supported.
Good, thanks. We've got a question about kind of what's coming next. Are we creating a report online for the findings? How will we share more information that's coming from Rianne?
Of course it would come from Rianne. She just wants to get her hands on the data. So yes, Rianne, we will, as I said, Beth is squirreling away, project managing, program managing a new website launch for us. So as soon as that website goes live, the data will appear on there in headline form. But we've made the point several times, the picture is changing so dramatically at the moment. Any of you who are around Leesman in, when was it, 2014 or 15, when we got to 70 to 100,000 respondents and we started to see the data line stabilizing, I think we're predicting the same, that we need to get past 100,000 home working survey responses before the data settles down. So until that time, any release of the data must be with the massive health warning that people don't use it lazily. I think you can't just read a report and that replace the need to actually understand and measure, not just in terms of employee experience, but in terms of your utilization, your occupant densities, your vertical distributions, your travel to work strategies, and your cost of occupancy. And I think this is one area where the real estate, facilities management, workplace industry has been almost negligent over the last 10 years that the Leesman's been around in not understanding the impact of some of those variables on employee outcomes. And I made a statement about 4 weeks ago in a blog post that we've got on the website, a memo from the future, that recognized that we should have been asking that information from day one, when we did that first survey for Hanro in 2010, in terms of real estate footprint, cost of occupancy, occupant density, desk sharing ratios. So I give you the promise that going forward, we will try and do better in capturing that information. But Peggy, can you just maybe explain what we've been doing on the Leesman Plus data for the last 2 years?
Yeah, so with the Leesman Plus organization or workplaces, we've collected additional data points on those workplaces. So we have things like square meters and number of workstations and so forth. So we've then been able to basically look at potential patterns essentially between how much space you have and whether that has an impact on experience and these other types of metrics as well. And I'm not sure whether I did see a question here somewhere about whether we think that organizations are going to go towards having less space in the future or having more space in the future or less space because people are going to work from home, or whether they need more space because of social distancing. And I think actually the answer to that is it depends. I think that's my favorite answer here. It depends on what you're starting off from. So across those Leesman Plus workplaces that we've measured last year, the number of the square meters per person ranged from 7.5 to over 40. Now, given though the one with over 40 wasn't fully occupied yet, but basically that shows you what sort of a different situation each organization has entered this into. And it's going to be completely different. Do you need more space or less space? It depends on what the situation was before.
Great, thanks. Dan's got a question about meeting rooms and video platforms. So given the increased status of the video platform to support the dispersed work population to meet and collaborate in a more egalitarian manner, is the role of the physical meeting room space forever compromised?
Dan, a good one. And I think, you know, in your role in terms of designing the sort of spatial strategies as well as the experience strategies, I think it's a tough one. I think organizations are going to have to look very, very carefully at the whole user experience, user interface of enclosed space. And I think, you know, some of what we've got used to carrying around in terms of, handheld apps, right? You know, we're looking for that quality of experience now when we adopt a video call at home and I think in the office. So Peggy made the point around the growth in video conferencing. I think people will genuinely be expecting to answer a call as it comes in on their laptop through one of the platforms, pick up the laptop and go and find somewhere enclosed to have that if they're being acoustically respectful to their co-workers. I also think the one-touch meeting room proposition is also going to become highly focused, and room booking systems that beautifully integrate with video conferencing systems. Why are they separate? That's just clunky and old-fashioned. And I think we've become, we've had 8 weeks worth of immersion into platforms that automatically drop diary notes into your diary. And if you, in an office environment, we had it before in our own office, the meeting room you turn up to and it's already there and you can one-touch it in the room onto all of the call participants. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure in terms of budget allocation into better quality user interface spaces. And I think probably we're going to have to see more enclosed space, be that structural or be it the sort of, the pod type, pop-up type environments. Clearly, until such time as there's a vaccine though, there's anxiety that comes in with the sort of physical touching aspect of those spaces. And the ability for housekeeping teams to keep them biosafe for those employees. So yeah, a rocky path over the next few months until we're rid of this. I saw AstraZeneca were on the call. Come on, we need your support, and Novartis, right? I think they're doing some cool stuff as well, and all the other farmers. We need you to make the future of workplace much more viable for all the strategists on the call. So carry on with the good work.
If I could just add to that, I would say, even though video conferencing is working pretty well, as Tim made the point earlier, it's not just about what happens on the call. It's also the 5 minutes before and the 10 minutes after, which we are inevitably missing out on. So with that in mind, I don't think that the physical meeting will be completely basically abolished. I think we will need those also in the future. But currently, I guess the value proposition or the comparison between doing it virtually is, that's what we have to do. But I do think there's value with physical meetings also in the future.
I think, Dan, the other one there that was talked about last week on a call that I was on is that let's cast our mind back a year, right, or 6 months or something, where you were the only person dialing in remotely and everybody else was in the room, right? So you were the one on the big screen in the room. And as you dialed in, everybody was walking in, they were joking, they'd been making a cup of tea together, somebody was winding somebody up about something that was funny, right? And suddenly you're the outsider. And it's almost like that's turned around completely. But I think that's what will come back. And I think those dispersed workers will start to feel that as some come back to the office, that social magic stuff is really, really hard if you're on the outside down the fiber optic pipe. So I think that's where the value proposition of enclosed space and of the VC platforms will really, really come to the front of employee experience.
Good. We've still got some questions in there, so I want to try and crank through as many of these as we can. Richard's got a question about visibility. Tim, you touched on this in your wrap up with the trust that's been given to all these employees working remotely. But he wants to know if there's anything in the data that suggests visibility and presenteeism is a factor in drawing people back to the office. Conversely, if no one is there, is it no longer a factor?
Yeah, I think, Richard, I don't know, I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I think some of what I'm hearing from the clients that we've been drawn into some quite, deep conversations with HR leads, global HR leads, really starting, I think, to worry about this topic matter. Certainly we saw some, not that we had collected, but some insights from a couple of clients that suggested that younger employees were working ridiculously long hours because if they're online, they're seen to be contributing and fueling their career development. Whereas in the office, because you're visibly seen to be putting the effort in, that somehow they were having to overcompensate that from home. So I think it's one that will unravel for different organizations in different way, but goes back to the point we've made several times that not only did organizations enter the crisis with different real estate and technology capabilities, I also think they entered it with very, very different sort of organizational psychology strengths and weaknesses as well. So a tough one, I think, though, in the public sector where you are to understand the impact and where organizations were working on dispersing workforces regionally as historic agendas, you've almost got a sort of magnified implication of that. So tough one.
Excellent. Going back to the data, Jacqueline has asked, is there any chance of extending this survey to Africa? Maybe Peggy, you and Tim can cover that.
Well, there's African data in there already. In the live data, one of the organizations taking it has a big presence in the Middle East and Africa, so it's coming, it's on its way. And I don't know how many languages, sort of sub-Saharan languages we're in, but we could come back to you on that if that would be helpful. Maybe Alison, you could pick that one up and take that up offline.
And perhaps just worth also clarifying, I mean, the survey goes wherever you guys want it to go. So essentially, because the survey is deployed by organizations who want to deploy it, essentially, if you have a desire to do it, then just get in touch.
Excellent. We've got several questions in the Q&A about commuting. So is there any satisfaction difference between people with a long and short commute? Have we seen any effects of commuting on any of these scores?
So this is where, when I outlined the survey structure, I mentioned that you can add questions, and certainly a number of my clients have been adding questions around the mode of commute, the length of commute. So not within our core research, but clients definitely seeing an impact. We wrote a piece, check it out on the website. I don't know where that question was from geographically, but we wrote a sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek piece a little while back suggesting that maybe the Netherlands was the best equipped country in Europe to bounce back from COVID because of the greater use of self-powered transport rather than some of the city centres, New York and London, etc., Frankfurt, where much greater reliance on public transport. So I think that's one for a client to address locally within the additional question element of the survey, rather than us reporting on just yet.
Great. Kaya's got a question around the difference between LMI and HLMI. Obviously, what you covered is the HLMI at the moment is higher than our average LMI. Do you see a trend over time with the HLMI decreasing? Crystal ball gazing, anyone?
Peggy, I'm not commenting on that one.
I think in one way it could go either way. I think as people have worked from home longer, it you know, certain things you start missing, and it could be that you're basically, your sentiment starts drifting, and for this very reason, we're also currently developing a new tool where basically we're enabling organizations to do measurements more so on a pulse basis, and basically continuing to measure the most important parts of the home experience. So I think time will tell. I think in one way it could go either way.
Good.
Hanging out with us, aren't they?
Yeah, we'll just keep going through. I've got
a... That's the point. So,
well, I think we'll get to a couple more before we let everyone go. Susanna's got a question. What new rules would you suggest for people returning to the office? This is similar to some of the ones we had earlier in our first session today, where people are asking, you know, what are people doing with the data, and how are they helping? How is the data helping them with that return to the office?
Yeah, well, I think this is where, you know, more and more of the clients we're talking to now, well and truly through the sort of crisis management tactical phase, they've resolved any of the glitches that they've had in terms of dispersing employees, and as governments progressively start to relax some of their social distancing expectations, increasingly clients, you know, buying into the Leesman office survey with the home working survey bolted on in order to do a direct comparison between that. Now, what that might reveal, you know, is local to every client, and almost that my point earlier about the internal benchmarking value, to actually understand your strengths and weaknesses inside your own portfolio, inside your own roles, inside your own lines of business and teams, is what those clients, I think, more than anything are doing. And we've mentioned it a number of times. This, you know, and given what's happening in the world around trust, I think this is where those organisations seeing the huge value in developing a trusting relationship with your employee, based on inviting back first those employees who need it most, based perhaps on their home working space, their accommodation, maybe it's based on their role, maybe on their commutes, or the public transport implication of their commute. So I think that's one of the many ways that the clients in the next wave are using. It's to be that sort of empathetic, high emotional intelligence, engaged employer in understanding and measuring exactly where employees are conceptually in their head in terms of the role.
And I'd like to add to that, just I'm not going to go into details in terms of what sort of rules would be good to have in the office. I would more perhaps encourage to think about what is going to be the experience of employees as they come back, if basically what's waiting for them is the office that they remember from a long time ago, that is completely plastered with a lot of do's and don'ts and so forth. So think about the general experience, and keep in mind that some people may become coming back a little bit anxious, and if what they see the first thing they come to the office is massive warning signs and do's and don'ts. I think that's going to have a big impact on whether they want to come back the next day. So.
Yeah, I think Peggy's point is critical there. If you take my earlier comments around perhaps the need for creative and collaborative employees because of their role is greater to come back first, manage their expectations, because if actually what they're coming back for is to be collective, and the space is covered in hazard tape and stickers on the floor telling them to stay apart from each other, then manage that expectation really proactively in terms of active communication. And you know, the tools that we're developing that aim to do that you know, are one component, but I think open dialogue between real estate teams, facility management teams, HR teams, in terms of the implication for those geographies, co-location issues are really, really key.
Everything you just touched on connects to Hanro's question about fear. Do you think that fear is causing people to rate home working higher if they don't feel safe, perhaps, to return to the office?
you know, Hanra, I think, you know, we're never in anybody's mind. We can never completely bubble wrap the survey, sanitize it in a sense from an employee's anxiety or their concerns or their desires, right? You know, so for every employee that that you have that's super anxious and worried about every aspect of their biosafety on the return, there are probably other employees at the opposite end of the bell curve who are, you know, pretty flippant towards it. And I went back into our own office yesterday, and you know, I live in the suburbs outside of London, 30 miles northwest of London, and I mean, here somebody would cross the road to the opposite side of the road on a pavement for us to be socially respectful to each individual's distance. That's not happening in central London, I can tell you. It's like, you know, realistically, you'll be lucky if somebody just sort of, you know, acknowledges that they've gone to the opposite corner of the paving slab that you both happen to be on. So I think the one thing I guess that we've always promoted is that with high response rates, if you imagine the sort of bell curve of respondents, for everybody at the upper end who might be super anxious if we were measuring anxiety levels, there are a whole load of people at the bottom end who are much more, I don't know, sort of casual about it, or perhaps a little bit more flippant or robust in terms of their approach to the situation. And of course, very much determined by local geographies as well, what you're being told locally, what the infection rates are doing locally, what measures you're putting in place as a real estate manager for biosafety on that return. So.
And then also remember that we are measuring experience, and experience is people's subjective view based on the situation they're in. And things like being afraid to go back to the office may impact that, but it doesn't mean that the data is less accurate, because if anxiety is impacting how they're scoring things in the survey, then that is their experience.
I just want to answer one other question, and then I think we probably need to let everybody go. There was one which is an old question often asked around statistical difference between male and female employees. If Peggy hasn't covered it, it's normally because there isn't anything to see here, so sort of move on and get to the interesting stuff. The difference that we would typically see in an office survey between male and female employees, literally, you could only just get a cigarette paper between it in almost every survey. And Peggy, correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much the same that you're seeing on the workplace, the home workplace survey.
Yeah, correct.
Cool. Look, thank you for everybody who stayed hanging out with us, 70 plus of you, stayed on for some more. Data junkies or workplace strategy junkies that you are. Great having you around. You know where we are. If you don't, there have been a few comments about people who don't have a Leesman contact. We've got your contact, obviously, because you registered, so just drop a note on that before I close the call off in about a minute's time. You know, thanks for joining us. Your time's valuable. If there's anything we can do to help in your future strategies, your midterm strategic work, or your long-term visioning, you know where we are. The tool is there. It's in the 37 languages. If it's not in a language you need, that's our problem, not yours. We'll sort that out. So reach out to your local contacts. Thanks to my team, to Beth specifically, who's made the technology work beautifully again. Awesome job, Beth. If you've got colleagues, I think there's still a few places left, Beth, on the next call. I can't even remember when it is. This is like Groundhog webinar. But do point anybody at Beth if you'd like them to join the similar webinar this afternoon. Thanks very much for your time, everybody. See you all again soon.
Thank you.